If you're a book club person, I also lead a book club with another professor, Amy. Normally we talk about plants, but because it's Nobel and insects are on our mind, we are looking at the Nobel book this year. So if you want to join us, it's low stakes. You just kind of come hang out, chat with professors and students alike. It's not just a professor book club. But I wanted to put that on there in case you were interested. All right. So we're actually going to get into content today. So hopefully you all have PowerPoint ready or prepared or something to write with at the very minimum, because we're going to start with the very basics of biology. And so starting with the very basics of biology, what is the definition? Right? Well, it's the study of living organisms divided into many, many specialized fields that cover anything from their morphology, physiology, anatomy, behavior, origin, distribution, um, even beyond these definitions, like the ecology, how organisms work together, whole range, right? Biology is huge. There's so many disciplines. But one of the key things in this definition is that we're looking at a living organism, right? So right away, I'm going to have us start with a group activity. I'm going to come around and make sure everybody has a group, because I don't want to say look to your neighbor, because sometimes you don't have a neighbor. But as a group, I want you to think about, first of all, by yourself for a minute, what does it mean to be a living organism? Right? And then after a minute has elapsed, you can chat with your group and see what others have come up with for this answer. I'm going to start the minute now, and I'm going to come around and make sure everybody has a good group. Right, so what does it mean to be a living organism? Do you feel comfortable being a group three? Yeah. Okay, getting group two? So hopefully you reflected on what it means to be a living organism. Go ahead and chat with your group now. We still have a minute here, but All right, so hopefully you've had some time to discuss. Who wants to share what they came up with? Who was that? Oh, yeah. Anna. Yes, go ahead. Yeah, growing, reproducing, homeostasis, interaction with other organisms. Anyone want to add something to that definition? Okay, yeah, responding to stimuli. Do we have other answers? Yes. Yeah, yeah, it can adapt or over time evolve to something. Yeah, it's made up of some sort of structure. Do we have anything else you want to add? Pretty comprehensive. I mean, I put on my slides here that there's some structure to it, it responds to stimuli, can reproduce, it grows, maintains an internal equilibrium, so homeostasis. But this list is not exhaustive, right? There's a lot that makes up a living organism. But we're not talking about like a rock, right? We're talking about something that has some sort of response to it. So in Bio 101, we're kind of going to go through a survey of all the different levels of organization that these living organisms could fall into. Anywhere from the very smallest of atoms, which is where we will start today, all the way up to ecosystem, right? Beyond ecosystem, there's biosphere, which is kind of like the whole planet. We're not going to touch on that in Bio 101, but we will get all the way up to ecosystem. So we'll go from atoms, cells, organs, populations, and eventually how individuals respond to one another, right? And keeping in mind that scientists study all of these levels of biology, right? You can be an ecologist, you can be a microbiologist. The possibilities are pretty endless. But we're going to start at the very bottom. We're going to start with atoms today. And so hopefully you have watched that video that I asked you to watch, taken that really short quiz. Right, like I said, it's a low stakes quiz. It's basically complete or incomplete, did you do it? And the questions are not hard. So if we're talking about atoms, right, we're talking about the smallest functional unit, right? Now we know atoms have subatomic particles like protons, neutrons, and electrons, right? But functionally, the atom is the smallest unit, right? Atoms can combine together to form molecules, which we will talk about at the end of this lecture today. I thought it was really interesting. That video that you watched, they showed an image of a nitrogen atom that they had been captured. And it's interesting, I tried to find that image, and one of the only places it's published is in that video. All right, there's a paper that came out before the nitrogen atom with this gold atom here, and that was published in a paper. When the nitrogen atom was photographed, they're like, well, that's redundant of the gold paper. They didn't actually publish it. So, interesting tidbit there. But just recently, we got the first X-ray image of an atom, just this year, right? And so it's a different method of looking at atoms, but they're so small. They're so hard to photograph. So this is really impressive work that's being done. You did watch that video, and so we're just going to do a quick individual review. This should be fairly easy. I'll give you a minute here just to fill in the blanks on my image here. Note that these could have multiple answers depending on what you say is blue and what you say is green here. But I'm going to give you a minute, and then I will ask for volunteers to share their answers. also include if they have a charge. I know I didn't give you a lot of time here, but hopefully after watching that video, this should be pretty easy. So who would like to share their answers? Yes, Maddie. Sure, yeah. Yeah, very nice. So we have protons and neutrons in the middle. You could have labeled them vice versa here. Protons having that positive charge and electrons circling the nucleus has that negative charge to it. All right, so the video talked a little bit of atomic structure. We're going to dive in a little deeper here. So before we kind of continue on to all the nuances with electrons and electron shells, I just want to step back and say if you change a part of an atom, right, it could completely change it. So right here I have the structure of a sodium atom, and if I were to say take away a proton, right, that can completely change it. It's going to become a neon atom now, right? Same if I were to add a proton. So instead of 11 protons, I have 12 protons. Completely changes the atom. It is now magnesium, no longer sodium, right? So protons, if I add or take away, it can completely change that element. But electrons, right, I could take away an electron or I could add an electron. That's not going to change the atom itself, but instead what it will do will change the charge. So this is a sodium atom here, right, that instead of 11 electrons, it has 10 electrons. So it has lost a single negative charge, making this sodium overall have a positive charge. So when an atom has a charge, we call it an ion, right? We are going to go over this on Monday, right? But I just want to put this in here that you can change an electron. It's not going to change the element, but it might change the charge. All right, so we're going to take a look at nitrogen as kind of our model atom here, right? And so when we look at our atom, we have our nucleus with our protons and our neutrons, and we have our electrons orbiting that nucleus. If we want to kind of define this further, we can say that these electrons can be found in orbitals, right? So this is very much a simplified picture showing these rings. In reality, they are not going to fit in these nice rings. Rather, electrons will be found in these regions surrounding the nucleus. So an orbital is a region that has a high probability of having electrons, and an orbital can contain 2 electrons. It can also contain 1, but max, it'll have 2 electrons. So we see we have an orbital at this very top here. That is a full orbital with 2 electrons. Same with the one just below it here. That has 2 electrons. But there's also these 3 other orbitals. Now they are not full. They only have 1 electron, but they are an orbital nonetheless. All right, so an orbital is a region of finding electrons. These orbitals can be grouped into electron shells. So again, if we look at this nice simplified picture for us here, these rings represent the electron shells, right? So in these shells, we can have groups of orbitals, right? So for example, this first electron shell has 1 orbital that is full and has 2 electrons, right? So that is the first electron shell. As we go further out, that electron shell gets bigger in diameter. It can now hold more orbitals. And we see the second one actually holds 4 orbitals, not all of them being full in the case of nitrogen. Only that top one is full, right? But it could hold up to 8 electrons in those 4 orbitals. And these outer electrons are very important when it comes to different bonds. These are our valence electrons, right? So those electrons in the outermost electron shell. Very important for forming bonds. We'll talk about this very soon here. Any questions so far? All right. I added in this next slide, not because I want you to memorize this, but because you might see these on some diagrams of atoms. So when we talked about these electron shells, I said that innermost one can have one orbital that holds 2 electrons. And as we go out, we can hold more orbitals and thus more electrons. So for example, that second shell can hold a maximum of 8. The third one can hold 18, 32, 50, and so on, right? So it can get very large very quickly. As you go up or away from the nucleus, right, these electron shells have different energies associated with them. So closest to the nucleus, you have the lowest amount of energy. As you go further and further away, that energy increases. I'm not going to elaborate on this now, but when we talk about photosynthesis, we'll start to apply this concept. And finally, again, I don't expect you to memorize this. I don't have this memorized, right? But you might see different letters associated with the different electron shells. For example, this first one will always be called K, second one will always be called L, all right? Just in case you see this on a diagram. All right, if we're talking atoms, we have to talk the periodic table. However, this is not a chemistry class. I'm not asking you to memorize the periodic table. I just want you to know how to read one, right? So on our periodic table of elements here, we are looking at elements, right? So an element is a pure substance made of only one specific atom, all right? So if I say element, if I say atom, they can be used kind of interchangeably here. So an element only has that specific atom in it. If we look at our chart, right, there's a bunch of different symbols. We will have the symbol, the letter symbol or 2-letter symbol for each atom, as well as the name, either below or on top, depending on what periodic table you look at. It will tell you the name. It has this atomic number, right? And this is probably the most important thing that I'm going to tell you about this periodic table, is the atomic number is the number of protons that an element has, right? So you automatically know the number of protons, and from watching that video, you know that protons generally equal the number of neutrons as well as electrons, though there can be some exceptions. But we know if we change that number, we're going to end up with a different element entirely. And then finally, we have that atomic weight in the corner here, right? That is the weight of that atom relative to the weight of other atoms. I'm not going to go into that. You will learn this in chemistry if you take chemistry, and they'll probably go into this a little bit more specifically. All right, I have another group activity, all right? I am going to go around and give each group an element, and I want you to draw that element. I want you to determine how many protons, electrons, and neutrons it has, how many orbitals it has, how many electron shells it has, and is that electron shell full? I'm going to give you 4 minutes, and then again, I will ask for groups to share their answers. Let's start over here. We'll do oxygen, neon, helium, sodium, coming to the second row here, boron. We'll go back to oxygen here. I didn't miss a group there, right? Oh, yeah, that's right. Group of 2, group of 2, group of 3. So boron, oxygen, neon. Over here, we'll go helium, and in the front, we'll go back to sodium. So take those 4 minutes, draw it out, answer those questions. It's also a good time to ask me questions if you have any. You have it correct. Yeah. So we're going to have time shell. And this slide, you can see that the first electron shell and then have a next. And then all those two electrons combine together. I would start by putting in one electron in each orbit, and then as you add more, add the decrease. Yes, that's very good. Oh, I forgot to mute it. I apologize. How many orbitals are the electrons have? Yes. So if you go back to that slide where I had shown a giant atom with a bunch of definitions, I said I'm not going to do it. Yes. So if you look at the first electron shell, it says electrons and normal and orbital chemistry. This is the second with the electrons. There's two for the orbitals, two for orbital, and so on. Does that make sense? No? It doesn't make sense. Yes, but I would, instead of, I only see 3 of those here, not all 4, and then 2 of them are just. Let me move on to the next slide, and I actually have pictures with answers, and this might make more sense. All right, so moving on here. I'm going to ask for individuals to share their answers. I have given you the drawings for each of them here, right? I heard there was a lot of confusion. Orbital, where those electrons go. I understand that is confusing. So for each electron shell, right, it will have a certain amount of orbitals. This first one will have 1, so it'll have 2 electrons max. That second electron shell will have 4 different orbitals, right? Now, not all of them are full. You want to put at least 1 electron in each orbital if you can, right, before adding in that second one, right? So you might have drawn it 2, 2, and 2, right? But that would leave an orbital that's empty. And so I would split one of those so that we can have all orbitals containing something. This is kind of how they behave. Yeah, now it's not all nice and neat like this, but you will have the regions. If you're taking chemistry in like the S arrangement or the P arrangement, but you'll have regions where these electrons are found, and in these regions you can only have a max of 2. Does that make sense? Yes. So we have regions surrounding our nucleus, right, where we can find electrons. High probability of electrons being there. These regions are called the orbitals, and these orbitals can only contain a max of 2 electrons. They might only contain 1, but maximum they can only be 2. Which is why often when we simplify our drawing, you often see 2 paired together. Okay. Yes? The third one, I am going to have to back on my slide because, giving me the answers. I don't know off the top of my head. I always have to cheat and look. So if I look here, I see the third electron shell can have 18 electrons. I know they can be split into the orbitals, which contain 2. So I basically go 18 divided by 2. I can have 9 different orbitals there. Yes, cool. There we go. I don't know. So goes up by 4 each time. 4 orbitals? 4 electrons. I see what you're saying. Yeah, that's a nice trick. I didn't know that trick. I'm not going to ask you this on an exam, but if you're taking chemistry, maybe they might want you to know this. All right, so if we go back, I kind of gave you the answer for oxygen already. So if you had oxygen, right, we have 8 because that atomic number is 8. We have 5 orbitals, right? So I have 1 in the middle in that first electron shell, and then 4 orbitals on that second electron shell. So I have 2 electron shells. Is my electron shell full? It's not full because I could theoretically add more electrons to 2 of those orbitals. Right? Who had neon that would like to share? Yes. Oh, do you want to share? I just saw your hand go up. Right. Yes. Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, and we can see that outer electron shell is full because all of the electrons that we can possibly put in it are there. Right? Who had helium? Who would want to share their answer? I don't think I've heard from the back. Do you want to share an answer? Yeah, helium's a pretty easy one. You lucked out on that one. For sodium, who wants to share their answer? Let's see, I'm going to go in the back here. Remind me your name. All right, go ahead. Press the right button here. There we go. So, yes, I put 11 here because I would not know or expect you to know that it actually does have a different number of neutrons. It has to do with the electrostatic force in an atom and balancing things out. Nuances, I'm not going to do anything. Yes. No. Oh, I did say that. I'm going to go back on what I said, actually. So I'm only going to say count the orbitals if they have an electron. So that is a very good point. So if we look at this atom here, we see this outermost one could have 9 orbitals, right? But it doesn't have enough electrons to fill 9 orbitals. And so in this case, it only does end up with 1. Right? Now there is space for other orbitals in here, but it only has 1 valence electron, 1 on the outer ring. Does that make sense? All right. For boron, I'm just going to go ahead and give you the answer here. So boron, very similar in answer, right? We have the atomic number 5. 5 electrons, protons, and neutrons. Again, not necessarily true, but I would not expect you to know that. 4 orbitals, right? The first one is full. The second one, you can only put electrons in 3 of those orbitals, so it only has 4 orbitals to it. 2 electron shells, and no, it is not full on that outermost shell. All right. I'm going to kind of move us along. If you still have questions, talk to me after class or office hours. I'm happy to kind of do a lot of review on this. I did want to point out that there's a lot of elements, but there's only really 4 that are most prominent in many organisms, including the human body here. And if we look at oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, right, those 4 atoms, 4 elements, actually make up 95% of our total mass. They are the most prominent, right? Not to say that these other elements do not matter, right? They're still there. They're playing important roles. We can't live without them. But they only make up less than 1% or less than 0.01% of our total mass, which is pretty incredible if you think about us being mostly composed of 4 different elements. All right. Are there any questions? All right. If you don't want to ask a question in class, talk to me after class, office hours. If that feels intimidating for you, I understand. You can always ask a question anonymously. This link is also up on Moodle, and I will try to answer it during the next class period. All right. So we talked about atoms. Now let's talk about molecules. So now we're talking about more than one atom. So a molecule is 2 or more atoms that have been bonded together, right? Now, if this molecule has different types of atoms bonded together, so they're not just oxygen or just nitrogen, maybe it's oxygen and hydrogen, we would call it a compound because the atoms are different. There's more than one element in that molecule, right? Now, depending on what molecules or what atoms are bonded together into this molecule can change its properties. And a great example of this is sodium, right? So sodium, if we bond the sodium atom to a chloride atom, we're going to get table salt, right? We eat table salt every day, right? It's in a lot of our foods. It's pretty harmless. But if you bind this sodium to hydrogen oxide, or hydrogen and oxygen to create sodium hydroxide, right? That's actually pretty corrosive, all right? You do not want to ingest that. So these properties can change depending on what elements are bonded together. So we have to talk about the different types of chemical bonds, right? So if we're talking about these atoms, all right, we know there's different charges in an atom. So if we look up top here, right, opposite charges attract. So this positive nucleus is going to be attracted to the negative electrons, right? But like charges have a repulsive force, and so the 2 nuclei, right, are going to be repulsive of each other because they're both positive charges, right? Same with those electrons. Now, atoms and molecules, they like to be in a really stable state, right? You can think of it as they don't want to have a lot of chaotic energy to them. So in molecules, want to be in that stable state, they have to find this balance between being attracted to the opposite charges and being repulsed by those positive charges, right? And they can find that somewhere there's some overlap that has the lowest amount of chaotic energy, and that's the stable state that they're going to be bonded in. All right? So if they have too much repulsion, right, and I recognize that this diagram really should say no repulsion there because they're so attracted to each other. They're almost going to be impossible to break apart, right? On the opposite end, we have no attraction whatsoever. It's going to be really hard to make them bond. But we have this little happy medium here. Some attraction occurs, we get some bonds, and depending on the type of bond, we could have covalent, ionic, or hydrogen. We have a little less than 10 minutes left, so we're going to start with our covalent bonds, and whatever we don't finish will be on Monday here. All right, covalent bonds. I know this is a lot of content. I really try to break this up and not overloading you, but there's a ton to get through this semester. So we're going to start with these covalent bonds. All right. In covalent bonds, atoms share electron pairs, or share electrons in an orbital. Right. So when we look at this example here, we have fluorine and hydrogen. Those valence electrons are on the outermost shell, and those outermost shells are not full, meaning we have an orbital that is not full. Right? This is not a very stable configuration for our atoms. Our atoms want to be stable, so they will readily share an electron from another atom that does not have a full outer shell. Right? They will share them together so that both the fluorine and the hydrogen are in more or less a stable state. All right? So when we look at fluorine, all right, we see that that outer shell is now full because they're sharing that pair. And the hydrogen's outer shell is also full because they're sharing that pair. This is a really, really strong bond, right? This is the strongest bond that we can have. Right? Now, depending on your molecule, and you saw this when we did all those individual molecules here, some of them might have orbitals that are mostly not full, right? So carbon's a great example. It has 4 orbitals, but none of those orbitals are full, meaning that it could form potentially 4 bonds to fill up those orbitals. All right? I'm going to illustrate that in this next slide too. So on these covalent bonds, I'm going to stick with carbon here. Carbon, we know, has 4 orbitals with 1 electron in each. Right? It wants to fill those orbitals, and so it's going to bond with 4 hydrogen atoms, right, and create 4 of these covalent bonds. Right? Now its outermost shell is full, it is stable, that atom is happy. Right? Same with the hydrogen atoms. Outermost shell is full, they are happy, they are satisfied. There can be the case where you get double bonds or even triple bonds where they share more than 1 pair, right? So in this case, this carbon atom is only sharing 1 pair of electrons with this hydrogen. Right? In a double bond, this carbon atom is sharing 2 pairs with this oxygen here, and 2 pairs with this oxygen on this side. Right? But if you count it up, right, this outermost shell, if it's full, it should have 8 electrons, and we can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Outer electron shell is still full, right? But they're sharing 2 pairs of electrons rather than 1 with the adjacent atom. Right? Same is true for these triple bonds. We're sharing 3 pairs of electrons. All right. Questions so far? All right, I'm going to introduce yet another new concept. All right, electronegativity. Okay, and we're going to see this word in the next couple of lectures here. So, electronegativity. Atoms have differing electronegativities, which means some atoms tend to hog electrons more than others. Right? So it's that attraction for shared electrons. If we see in this table here, right, this oxygen atom over here has an electronegativity of 3.5. That means it's really highly electronegative. That means if it's going to bond with another atom, right, especially if that atom has a lower electronegativity, like these on this end here, right, those shared electrons are going to be closer to the oxygen, right, because the oxygen wants to hog those electrons. All right. I'm going to keep explaining this as we go through the next few slides, and hopefully it will click, right? So in covalent bonds, depending on the electronegativities, we could have bonds that are nonpolar or polar. If they are nonpolar, right, it means that our atoms basically have really similar electronegativities. One atom is not hogging the electrons more than another. They are really equally shared. Right? So it's a nonpolar covalent bond. We can see that this is carbon and hydrogen. If we look at this table here, right, carbon has an electronegativity of 2.55, hydrogen of 2.20. They're pretty close together, so much so that neither one of them are going to be hogging those shared electrons. Right? Now that's different for a water molecule. Right? We have oxygen here, which has an electronegativity of 3.44, which is pretty high, and hydrogen at 2.20. This has a higher electronegativity. It's going to want to hog these shared electrons. So these shared electrons are going to be closer to the oxygen atom than they are to the hydrogen atom. Right? When this happens, we get a polar covalent bond. Right? Now it's polar because there's some polarity there, right? Meaning that one side or one atom is going to have a different charge than the others. Right? So if we're looking at these polar covalent bonds, again, we're sticking with water, right? We have two covalent bonds here, right? We know oxygen is highly electronegative. It wants to hog those shared electrons. So in this image here, I recognize the numbers are a little blurry, but this red is indicating that most of the electrons are going to be found around the oxygen. It's pulling those shared electrons with its hydrogens closer to that oxygen atom, right? And because it has these extra electrons closer to it, right? Electrons are negatively charged, and so if I'm hogging more of those negative charges, inherently that side of the molecule is going to have a slightly more negative charge to it. Right? More electrons, more negative charge, that atom is going to have a slight negative charge to it, which is what is indicated in this picture here. Right? Our oxygen atom, this delta negative here, meaning it's a partial negative charge. Right? It's more negative because the electrons are closer to this oxygen. Right? Likewise, this hydrogen, right? The electrons are pulled away from it. It's kind of losing some of those those negative charges, right? And so what's remaining is something that's a little bit more positive, right? So we could say that hydrogen has a partially positive charge here. Do we have any questions? Yes.
So when it's high, when it's negative, it's
Yes, so if we have, and we're not going to get to this here, but if we have these atoms, all right, and one of those atoms has a higher electronegativity than the other, then it would be a polar covalent bond because it's hogging some of those electrons.
if it's equal,
Yes, if it's equal or really close to being equal, all right? For example, this oxygen here, all right? They're exactly the same, right? There's no polarity, not one oxygen is going to be hogging the electrons more than the other. We can say this is nonpolar, right? Because they have the same electronegativities. Any other questions? All right, we're not going to get to this slide today. We have like a minute left. I would recommend going through this on your own. I will have a slide very similar to this on Monday. As far as homework goes, there is no homework. All right, enjoy your weekend. I'm not asking you to do anything, but please remember there is a pre-lab quiz for your lab due Monday at noon. All right, so don't forget about that, and don't forget to come see me in office hours before next Friday.